Have you ever met someone who gave up on being loved? Because that's exactly where this story begins. In the silence of an isolated house, behind windows that were always closed, lived Michael. A man who has had it all: applause, victories, the feeling of being invincible. But life, relentless, chose a specific day to turn everything upside down. A brutal accident. A second of carelessness. And everything he knew about freedom was tied to a wheelchair and the weight of a grief that no one saw. Michael didn't just lose the movement in his legs. He lost his laugh, the sparkle in his eyes, and the desire to open the door. For years, he pushed everyone away. Family, friends, caregivers, everyone. Until one day, Ellie came in. Ellie didn't know the whole story. "I just wanted a new job. I was in a hurry to save money to go back to studying, to rebuild my life after a series of unsuccessful attempts." When she saw the advertisement for a job as a caregiver in a remote house, she had no idea that inside lived a man who had already given up on everything. Their first meeting was pure silence. Michael didn't look her in the eye. He didn't say good morning. Ellie, however, sensed something. There was pain, yes, but there was also someone trapped inside, waiting to be seen. Not with pity, with truth. She had two choices: continue with the cold routine of caring for a body, or try to reach a soul. And that's what she did, little by little, calmly, with presence. At first, it was just the practical gestures, the bath, the medicine, the meals. But Ellie brought more. A soft song as she cleaned the room, a shy comment about the weather, a book purposely left beside the chair. Michael didn't say anything, but he didn't send her away. And it stayed. What Ellie didn't know was that inside that broken man, there was still room for hope, for laughter, for love. And what Michael never expected is that someone would choose to stay. But she stayed, and in that stay, something started to change. Because sometimes, the greatest form of care is simply not leaving. And this is where the story really begins. Because what was born between Michael and Ellie wasn't just care. It was presence. It was love where there was only silence. This story is for anyone who has ever felt invisible, for anyone who doubted that they could still be loved. If this touched you, like the video now. Your like shows that stories like this still need to be told. And sign up. Here, each new story is a reunion with what is most true in life, the love that heals. And what happened the day Michael finally said her name, you'll find out now. She wasn't looking for any big thrills. She just needed a job. Something stable, where she could save some money and, who knows, maybe get back to studying after her mother got sick. Ellie, with her clear, tired eyes, had no idea that her first job as a caregiver would be in a place where words barely existed. The ad was straightforward: man in recovery, lives alone, needs support with food and medication. Fixed salary, stable hours. Perfect for someone who was starting over from scratch. And she was. The house was on top of a hill, surrounded by dry trees and a silence that screamed memories. When Ellie arrived, she was greeted by a hurried assistant who simply said, "He doesn't talk." "Don't worry, just do your part." And then it disappeared. Michael was sitting in front of a huge window. His back was broad, his body strong but still. The wheelchair was part of him now, like a silent extension of his pain. But what caught the most attention was not his injured body. It was his gaze. A gaze that sought nothing, that did not react, that seemed to have already given up on any return. Ellie didn't say anything that first day. She just watched. She did her chores carefully. She organized the medicine, prepared the meals, and always left the tray on the table with a soft "here you go." Michael didn't respond. Not a shake of his head. Not a sigh. Nothing. But he didn't send her away either. And that was enough for her to come back the next day. Little by little, Ellie began to learn the codes of the house. She knew that he preferred his tea unsweetened, that he hated the light on in the morning, and that he was always most tense on Fridays, the day of the accident, she would later discover. Even in the silence, she listened. Even in the absence of words, she read signs. And with that, something began to happen. Small changes. A cup moved, a blanket adjusted. A book that had previously been untouched now had a page marked. Ellie noticed and respected every step. She didn't invade. She didn't force. She just stayed. And in that stay, Michael began to notice that he was no longer alone. That delicate presence did not bring pity. It brought peace. Have you ever felt like someone saw right through you without saying a word? Ellie did that to him. And now, I want to propose something to you. If this story reminded you of someone, or awakened something inside you, a feeling, a memory, a longing, comment below. Each comment here builds this universe that we are creating together, where love stories with pain, silence, new beginnings, and overcoming find an echo. Because what was emerging between Ellie and Michael was more than just coexistence. It was a beginning, and it was just beginning. Michael was an enigma hidden behind invisible walls. He didn't speak, he didn't react, he didn't give in. It was as if his every gesture was a barrier built over the years to ensure that no one would get too close. For Ellie, it was strange at first, but over time, it began to become distressing. She did everything that needed to be done, bathing, giving medicine, meals. She maintained a professional tone, respected silences, cared without intruding. But there was something in that look, in that still body with the soul so alive behind it, that began to move her in an unexpected way. Michael wasn't rude. He wasn't hostile. He was absent, present in flesh and blood, but far away, like someone observing life from a place that no longer belongs to him. Ellie realized that he wasn't just rejecting her. He was rejecting the world, time, affection, touch. He was even rejecting his own history. She tried to remind herself every shift that this was a job, that her role there was technical, practical, necessary, but not emotional. And yet, something inside her insisted on staying after hours. She insisted on observing that man beyond his job, on finding meaning in the emptiness he left in the environment. Their routine became a silent choreography. She would arrive, he wouldn't look. She would say little, he would say nothing. And every day they repeated themselves with a precision that bordered on ritual. But Ellie began to notice the small cracks in that cold wall. One day, when she entered the room, she saw that Michael had turned his body slightly toward the window, a matter of centimeters. But that wasn't the position he had left him in. Another day, she found a crumpled sheet of paper on the floor. Michael had written something, a few scribbled words, but he soon gave up. That wasn't contempt. It was a fight against himself. And that's when she realized he wasn't trying to push people away because he wanted to. He was trying to protect what was left. Ellie began to notice the details. His hands, always clenched in fists, the way he flinched when she got too close, as if his touch was a reminder of everything he'd lost. But she didn't give up. Instead of breaking down the walls, she respected them. And so, little by little, Michael began to truly notice her presence. Once, as she adjusted the blanket over his legs, she noticed that he didn't flinch. He just let her. It wasn't much. But for someone who had grown accustomed to absence, allowing a simple gesture was almost a cry for help. Ellie began to bring small elements of life outside into the house. A flower from the garden, a new book with markings, a cookie that reminded her of the smell of childhood. Everything was left lightly, without expecting a response, but with a care that said, "I see you." She knew she was risking getting too involved. She knew this wasn't the kind of relationship where everything could be solved with a touch or nice words. She knew Michael was a minefield of trauma, and that any misstep could bring everything down. But still, she stayed. And what started as care turned into something else. A feeling that cannot be named immediately. That grows in silence. That doesn't demand, doesn't pressure, it just exists. But it was real. So real that one day, Ellie realized something in herself. She had been avoiding looking into his eyes for too long. As if, deep down, I already knew what I would find there. And she was right. Because between Michael's silence and Ellie's calm, something was born that didn't fit into labels. It wasn't sudden passion. It wasn't romanticizing pain. It was a connection so deep, so human, that it was frightening. One day, as she was arranging her books on the shelf, she dropped a photograph. It was Michael, years ago, standing, smiling, surrounded by friends. Ellie bent down to pick it up and, for the first time, she heard his voice, low and hoarse. That was before. 3 words, but they broke weeks of silence. Ellie didn't answer. She just looked at him with the same look she always had. The look of someone who didn't want him to go back to being who he was. She just wanted him to feel again. That was the day she understood. No one looked at Michael the way she did. Not with pity, not with haste, but with presence. And that was what he feared most, and needed most. And there, between the silences laden with the past and the small gestures of the present, an invisible decision began to form within him. And life, even with all the scars, began to move again, very slowly. But, for those who had already stopped, that was all. Night arrived with a stronger than usual wind. The curtains danced slowly, as if the silence of that house had found a rhythm to breathe. Ellie felt something different in the air, something heavier. Michael was restless from an early age. He didn't want to eat, he didn't want to listen to music, he didn't even look out the window, that small gesture that, in the last few days, indicated that he was still connecting, at least to the outside world. He was there, but he seemed further away than ever. It was after 10 at night that everything happened. Ellie had already finished her shift, had already put everything away, turned off the lights and was about to leave when she heard a dry noise coming from the bedroom. A muffled sound, followed by an even denser silence. She came back without thinking. He opened the door slowly and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Michael was crying. It wasn't a loud cry, with screams or sobs. It was a contained, painful cry of someone who had held it in for too long. The tears flowed uncontrollably, as if they had stored years of accumulated pain, stifled, swallowed. Ellie approached him gently, as if she didn't want to scare a wounded animal. She stopped a few steps away from him. She waited. And then, silently, he held out his hand. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and took that firm, large, calloused hand, and now it was shaking with weakness and fear. His skin was hot, almost feverish, but the touch was human. For the first time, completely human. That man who until yesterday had been just a distant presence, was now there. Open, fragile, real. Michael didn't say a word, but he didn't let go either. His hand remained in hers for minutes that felt like a lifetime. And in that moment, everything changed. Not by magic, not by miracle, but by truth. Because nothing is more powerful than being seen exactly as you are, and still being accepted. Ellie sat there, on the floor, next to the chair, her fingers intertwined with his. She felt the pain without understanding it all, but without wanting to run away from it. And in that touch, she heard more than any sentence could say. She heard, "I'm tired. I feel alone. I don't want to carry this alone anymore." It was the first time Michael had allowed contact. And more than that, it was the first time he had cried with someone around since the accident. He had cried before, of course. Alone. In the dark. Angry. But never like this. Never in front of someone. Never with his chest so open. And that surrender, even so restrained, was a kind of rebirth. After that, the days changed in tone. Michael remained silent most of the time, but his eyes no longer carried only pain. Now there was something more. A glimmer of presence. Of acceptance. Of lightness. Ellie didn't comment on that night. She never mentioned the crying, or the gesture. But she began to adjust her care with even more delicacy. She began to ask questions, even if he didn't answer. To tell little stories about his day, his childhood, the dreams he had yet to fulfill. And every now and then, he would move his head. A longer look. A sigh that seemed to say, "I'm listening." The following week, something else happened. While she was organizing her books, she found a note. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it was folded between the pages. The handwriting was his. It simply said, "She stayed." That was all. 2 words, but enough to make her heart race. Because in that gesture there was recognition, gratitude, and perhaps the beginning of something that neither of them could yet name. And it is at this point that I want to make an invitation. If you have been following this story up to this point, leave a comment. Write what you felt, what you saw in these two characters. Because when you comment, you are also participating in the story. It creates a space where other people who also carry silent pain feel less alone. Here, the comment is not just engagement. It is an extension of the narrative. It is where love continues to spread. And there's something you don't know yet. Michael's gesture that night was just the first of many. Because sometimes, it's when the pain finally finds space to escape, that love starts to come in. And what would come after that touch would change everything. Time passed, and Michael's house no longer seemed so cold. It was still silent, but not that heavy and lonely silence. It was a comfortable silence, like the one that settles between two people who already understand each other without needing to speak. The relationship between him and Ellie was not obvious. It did not fit into ready-made molds. It was not patient and caring, nor friends, nor lovers. It was something more subtle, deeper, a bond built in the intervals, in the simple routine, in constant care, and most of all, in true presence. Michael still did not speak much, but now he looked. He listened. Sometimes he let out a half smile, and this small gesture, in that reality, was almost a confession. Ellie, for her part, had also changed. The girl who had arrived insecure, afraid of getting involved, now entered the house as if she were returning to a safe place. He knew the place of each thing, the rhythm of each silence, and the weight of each gesture. I had learned to love that man without asking for anything in return. And for that very reason, he began to feel a fear he had never known before, the fear of having to leave. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that the phone rang with an offer. A private hospital in the big city had seen her name on a recommendation. They wanted to hire her for a stable position, with a good salary and the chance for growth. That was all Ellie had said she wanted since she arrived there. Security, a future, a path. She thanked him, asked for some time to think about it, and hung up. But when she turned around, she found Michael staring at her. He said nothing, but his gaze asked everything. She spent the night awake. You thought about your life. In his mother, in the interrupted studies, in the bills that always reached the limit. He thought about what was right, as expected, and thought about him. She thought about that man who once refused to even touch her hand, and who now, even without words, demonstrated something rare, trust. Not any trust, but one that can only be built with time, with care, with the gaze of someone who stays even when everyone else has gone. Ellie knew he wouldn't beg her to stay. Michael wasn't one for begging, but she also knew he wasn't the same man he'd been a few weeks ago. She knew that if she left now, something inside him would break again, and maybe this time there would be no going back. The next morning, she arrived early. She made coffee, organized his medicines, and sat in the armchair next to him. They were silent for minutes, just feeling each other's presence. Until, in a firm voice, she said, "They offered me a job. It's in another city, better salary, more stability." Michael didn't react immediately. He just squeezed the arm of his chair lightly. His face remained impassive, but his chest rose faster. "I thought about it a lot," she continued. "A lot, really. And I understood that this place here changed my life. But it wasn't the house. It was you." She paused for a few seconds. She swallowed her emotions and concluded, "So I've decided. I'll stay." Michael closed his eyes tightly, as if he needed to protect himself from a feeling too overwhelming to be controlled. And for the first time since the accident, he cried with relief. He cried with gratitude. He cried like someone who was afraid of losing and realized that he hadn't. Ellie came closer and, once again, took his hand. Only this time, he squeezed back. It was at that moment that she knew. She didn't need to hear it. She didn't need to make statements. The decision had been made, on both sides. She would stay. Because he didn't just need care. He needed her. And she, perhaps without realizing it, needed him too. This story is about invisible choices. About the courage to stay when the easiest thing to do would be to leave. About the strength of silent affection, of love that doesn't need to scream to exist. Ellie stayed, even though she was afraid, even though she had no guarantees. She stayed with her heart on fire and her feet on the ground. And by staying, she healed them both. And what happened after that gesture was yet to come. That morning, everything seemed the same. The soft light coming through the window, the same sound of the wind blowing through the trees, the smell of fresh coffee in the kitchen. But inside that house, inside those two bodies, Michael in the wheelchair, Ellie with her heart racing, something was different. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches. There were no promises. Just the silence of two hearts that had learned to breathe in the same rhythm. And that, for someone who came from pain, was more than enough. It was healing. Life around them continued with its usual haste, but inside, time had a different rhythm. Ellie was no longer just a caregiver. And Michael, he wasn't just a patient anymore. They were something that could not be labeled, that could not be explained. There were two survivors, each one with their own story of loss, with their emotional fractures, their unseen scars. But there, one in front of the other, they began to make sense. The love that grew between them did not come to solve everything. He came to give new shape to what seemed broken. He came to show that it's not about fixing someone, but about being present when everything seems lost. Michael began to allow himself more. Some days, I would struggle to hold a book, even though my fingers were shaking. Other days, I would venture a word or two. Not whole sentences, but small answers. Simple, direct, full of meaning. Ellie listened as if listening to rare music. And he responded with the look of someone who understands without demanding. One afternoon he asked what her perfume smelled like. Not because I wanted to praise, but because it was the first time in years that I noticed something like that. One detail, a smell, a trace of humanity. And that, for him, was a private miracle. Ellie has changed too. He now had a calm that he hadn't had before. A maturity that did not come with time, but with living with someone who had already faced rock bottom and learned to breathe there. She knew she was no one's heroine. He knew he wasn't there to save him, but he also knew that something between them had truly blossomed. No rush, no intention, and for that very reason, it was stronger than anything I had ever felt before. The neighbors were still whispering. His old family still avoided conversation. Some looked on with surprise, others with disbelief, but none of them knew what was going on inside. None of them saw what Ellie saw, the moment when he, a man who had avoided any touch for so long, began to hold her hand without fear. The way he began to observe the world through the window with a new light. How he left the door ajar, as if he was no longer so afraid of being found. Because love, there, was not a sudden passion. It was not a grand act. It was presence. It was constancy. It was a repeated gesture, made with truth. It was silent care, attentive listening, respect for the other person's time. And that was the greatest revolution. There were difficult days, of course. Days when Michael would shut himself down again, when memories of the accident would take over his body. Ellie didn't demand any reactions. She just stayed. Sometimes, she would stay by his side for hours without saying a word. Just for being there. Just for being. And it was on those days that he needed it the most. Because sometimes, the ones who need the most care are precisely those who spent their lives dealing with their own traumas without help. Those who never had the space to be fragile. Those who had to appear strong for so long that they forgot what it was like to be hugged without shrinking. Ellie offered that. A hug that didn't judge. A touch that didn't demand anything in return. A look that didn't say get well soon, but rather I'm here, no matter how you are. And it was that kind of love that healed them both. Michael started laughing again. A shy, almost childlike laugh. The kind of laugh that comes when you're safe. Ellie also started looking at herself in the mirror with more tenderness. Because there, in that home built from nothing, she discovered something she could never explain in words, that caring for someone with love was also a way of finding herself. And the most beautiful thing was realizing that this feeling did not come from a miracle. There was no apparition. There was no sudden salvation. It came from a process, from a real bond, from a walk side by side where both could be imperfect, hurt, insecure, but together, present, alive. They were not saved by a miracle, but by a feeling that was born slowly and truthfully. A love that did not ask for permission, was not rushed, was not shaped by expectations. A love that simply happened. Because sometimes, the ones who need to be taken care of the most are the ones who know how to take care of themselves the most when love blossomed. And it was in this blossoming, in this small and profound blossoming, that everything began to take on another meaning. Because what would come next was still being built. And their story, although already so full of intensity, still held something that no one expected. A few months passed, and the house, where only silence had once lived, now held life in every corner. The window remained open. The wind still danced through the curtains, but now there was music. Sometimes a soft piano, other times the sound of a light, almost shy laugh that escaped Michael without him noticing. Ellie remained there, not out of obligation, not out of promise, but out of choice. And this was the greatest gesture of love that anyone had ever done for him. Michael learned to live again. He never walked again, but he walked inside. He rebuilt parts of himself that he thought were lost forever. And it all started when someone decided to stay. Ellie, for her part, found meaning in the unexpected. He discovered that love cannot be planned. That sometimes, life gives you a mission, and that mission turns into a home. They didn't get married. They didn't make any big statements on social media. But every day, in simple ways, they reaffirmed what they had built. They drank coffee side by side. They watched the sunset in silence. They shared their fears without having to explain themselves. Michael spoke few words, but every time he looked into Ellie's eyes, it was as if he were saying, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And Ellie, with her sweet and firm manner, reciprocated with a smile that only exists in those who love without measure. This story doesn't end with a happily ever after. It ends with a "we stayed together, even when everything seemed to be falling apart." Because the love that saves is not the one that comes to solve everything. It's the one that stays when everything seems hopeless. It's the love that holds your hand firmly, even when it's shaking. The love that is silent, but never abandoned. And maybe, when you heard this story, you remembered someone, an absence, a longing, an old pain. Maybe you are waiting for a love that sees beyond your scars. Or maybe, you are that love in someone's life. The truth is that we all carry a piece of Michael and a piece of Ellie inside us. We have all, at some point, been hurt and silenced. And we have all, at some point, needed, or offered, this kind of care that has no name, but has truth. May this story remind you, where there is presence, there is healing. Where there is surrender, there is transformation. And where there is true love, there is always a new beginning. This was another story that proves, where there is truth, love always finds a way. Stories like these don't go unnoticed. They stay. They resonate. They move us inside, even without asking for permission. And those who feel it, know it. Here, each narrative is a mirror of pain, of healing, of new beginnings. This channel is made for those who have an open heart, for those who see beauty in what is real, in what is imperfect, but true. Following this journey is walking together through stories that not only touch, but transform. Now, write in the comments, "I believe in the love that remains." This phrase carries the essence of what we experience here. And by leaving this mark, you continue this story with us. Because here, every feeling matters. And every word shared makes everything pulse even stronger.